The northern reaches of the Scandinavian coastline do not merely meet the sea. They surrender to it in a jagged, timeless embrace of stone and salt. As the sun begins its long, languid descent toward the hem of the world, the light across the fjords undergoes a transformation that defies the quickness of human thought. It is a slow, methodical shifting of the spectrum, moving from the brilliant, blinding silver of high afternoon into a deep, resonant amber that clings to the moss-licked faces of the cliffs. These towering walls of granite, carved by ice and wind over millennia, stand as silent sentinels over the dark arteries of water that snake deep into the heart of the land. The water within the fjord is not the crashing, chaotic spray of the open Atlantic, but a heavy, rhythmic, pulsar-deep, obsidian mirror that swallows the light and holds it in its cold depths. Along the shoreline, the kelp forests sway beneath the surface, their long, amber-green ribbons moving in a hypnotic, undulating dance with the shifting tide. The scent here is primordial and thick. It is the smell of crushed minerals, of decaying serac drying on the rocks, and the sharp, clean bite of the coming frost that hitches a ride on the evening breeze. This is a landscape of vast, echoing silences, where the only sound is the occasional guttural cry of a lone sea eagle, circling the thermal currents or the rhythmic slap-hush of the swell against the barnacle-encrusted stones. The air is heavy with moisture, a fine, invisible mist that coats the skin and the wool of one's tunic with a cool, persistent dampness. As the sky transitions from amber to a bruised, dusty violet, the shadows of the mountains stretch across the water, reaching like long, dark fingers toward the opposite shore. The horizon is no longer a sharp line, but a soft, blurred boundary where the sea and the heavens melt into a single, seamless expanse of twilight. In this liminal space, between the day and the deep night, the world feels immensely old, and the passage of time seems to slow until every ripple on the water and every sigh of the wind across the high scree slopes is magnified, becoming a focal point of a quiet, terrestrial meditation tucked into a gentle, curving scythe of a cove, where the mountains pull back just enough to allow a strip of pebbled earth to meet the tide, lies a small fishing village. It is a cluster of dwellings that seem to grow directly out of the land itself, as if the earth had heaved upward to provide shelter for the folk of the north. The longhouses are low-slung and sturdy, built of thick oak timbers and topped with heavy layers of turf. These green roofs, shaggy with wild rye and meadow grass, are now dusted with the silver of the evening dew, reflecting the first faint stars that have begun to prick through the canopy of the sky. From the center of each roof, a small, square smoke hole allows a thin, wavering plume of pale blue woodsmoke to escape. The smoke does not rise quickly. It lingers, curling round the sod eaves, carrying with it the comforting, earthy aroma of burning birch and dried peat. It is the scent of the hearth, the signal that the labors of the day have reached their natural conclusion and the hours of the fire are beginning. On the shoreline, the tools of the village's survival are laid out with the precision of a ritual. The fishing boats, with their high, elegant prows carved into the likeness of serpents and water spirits, are pulled well above the high water mark. Their clinker-built hulls, dark with tar and sea salt, glisten in the fading light, looking like the scales of great slumbering beasts resting on the grey shingle. Beside them, the fishing nets are draped over long wooden racks. These nets, woven from heavy hemp and stained a deep ochre by the tannins used to preserve them, are heavy with the moisture of the sea. They drip with a slow, rhythmic plink-plink-plink onto the wet stones below, each drop contributing to the collective mechanical heartbeat of the village at dusk. The air here is colder than it is further inland, flavored by the breath of the ice-chilled water, yet it is tempered by the smell of the village, the temps of drying fish, the musk of the goat pens, and the persistent, grounding smell of the damp earth as the light continues to fail. The human presence in the village manifests not in sudden movements, but in a gradual softening of sound and shadow, the distant high-pitched calls of children who have spent the afternoon hunting for crabs in the tide pools or chasing one another through the low scrub begin to recede. Their voices carry clearly over the water, a melodic shorthand of play that eventually gives way to the lower, more resonant tones of their parents calling them home. In the small pens behind the longhouses, the livestock are settling. The sheep, thick-coated and sturdy, huddle together against the evening chill. Their occasional soft bleats and the rustle of their wool against the wooden slats of the pens, adding a texture of domestic peace to the atmosphere. A dog barks once, a sharp, clear sound that echoes off the cliff face, before falling silent as it finds its place by a doorway. Among the shadows of the beach, a figure moves with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who has learned to work with the elements rather than against them. This is Bjorn. His frame is broad, though his shoulders now carry a slight, permanent stoop, a testament to decades spent hauling heavy oars and lifting crates of silver-scaled herring from the depths. His beard is the color of the sea foam in winter, white and unruly, framing a face that is a map of his life's journeys deep, furrows around the eyes from squinting against the sun's glare on the water, and skin that has the texture of well-worn leather. In his right hand, he carries a modest string of fish, their bodies cool and firm, the scales catching the last of the purple light. Each step he takes on the pebbled beach is a conscious effort, his boots crunching into the wet shingle with a heavy, grounding sound. He feels the dampness of the air in his joints, a dull, familiar ache that serves as a reminder of the many seasons he has seen the sun set behind. These same mountains, Bjorn pauses at the edge of the shingle, where the stones give way to the packed earth and moss of the village path. He turns his head slowly, looking back at the fjord. The water is now a deep, impenetrable navy, nearly black where the shadows of the cliffs fall heaviest. He watches the tide, noting its height and the way it swirls around the base of the pier. To a man like Bjorn, the sea is not a static thing. It is a breathing entity, and he listens to its respiration with the focus of a physician. He notes the lack of whitecaps on the horizon, a sign that the winds have died down for the night, and the morrow may bring a calm. Misty start. He draws in a deep, lung-filling breath, tasting the salt, the smoke, and the subtle, sweet scent of the forest that lies just beyond the village perimeter. It is a good air, cold and honest. He begins his walk toward the center of the village, his movements unhurried. The path is narrow, winding between the longhouses and the smaller outbuildings where grain and salted meats are stored. He passes the house of the blacksmith, a sturdy structure built of heavy timber and stone. The forge has long since been extinguished, but the radiant heat still emanates from the walls, warming the air as Bjorn walks by. He hears the faint, metallic clatter of tools being tidied away inside, a final clink of iron on wood that signals the end of the smith's day. A few steps further, he passes a smaller hut where the weavers work. Through the timber walls, he can hear the rhythmic, hypnotic thrum-clack of a loom being readied for the morning. The sound of the wooden batten striking the warp threads with a muffled, percussive consistency. It is a sound of order and industry, a comforting domestic rhythm that has echoed through this valley for as long as he can remember. As he moves deeper into the village, the air grows warmer, thick with the concentrated smell of many hearths. He passes a group of 3 elderly men sitting on a bench made from a split log, their backs pressed against the sun-warmed planks of a communal storehouse. They are dressed in thick, grey woolen tunics, their hoods pulled up against the evening damp. They do not speak, for they have lived long enough to know that words are often unnecessary in the face of a beautiful twilight. One of them, a man even older than Bjorn, raises a hand in a slow, silent greeting. Bjorn nods back, a gesture of mutual understanding. They are the watchers of the sky, the men who hold the memory of the village in their bones, and as they sit there, they are as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the sea. They watch the way the stars are beginning to cluster in the north, reading the portents of the weather in the clarity of the air. Bjorn's path takes him past a longhouse where a family is already gathered for their evening meal. The walls of the house are thick, yet they cannot entirely contain the life within. He hears the low, melodic drone of a woman singing a lullaby to a restless infant, a song without many words, just a series of rising and falling tones that mimic the movement of the waves. He hears the clatter of wooden spoons against ceramic bowls and the occasional burst of laughter from a young man. A bright, sharp sound that cuts through the stillness before being absorbed by the heavy turf of the roof. To Bjorn, these sounds are a tapestry of safety. They represent the continuity of his people, a defiance of the cold and the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounds them. The heavy oak door thudded into its frame with a resonant, grounding weight. The sound muffled by the thick animal hides draped across the interior entrance to keep the biting northern draft at bay. As Bjorn stepped fully into the longhouse, the transition from the biting, salt-chilled air of the fjord to the stagnant, honey-thick warmth of the hearth was almost physical, a tactile embrace that seeped through his woolen layers. The interior of the longhouse was a cavern of amber light and breathing shadows, an elongated space defined by massive, upright timber pillars that had been hewn from the hearts of ancient pines. These pillars, darkened to a deep, lustrous obsidian by decades of rising wood smoke and the natural oils of the wood, bore the faint, ghost-like marks of the adze and the chisel. High above, the rafters disappeared into a hazy, soot-stained gloom where the smoke from the central hearth gathered in a lazy, swirling canopy before finding its way to the narrow aperture in the roof. The air here was a complex, layered tapestry of scents. The sharp, resinous tang of burning birch, the savory, heavy steam of a simmering pottage, the musk of damp wool drying near the heat, and the sweet, fermented undertone of ale resting in its tun in the center of the hall. The hearth served as the beating heart of the home, a long, rectangular pit lined with smoothed river stones that had been scorched white and grey by 1,000 fires. The flames did not roar. They pulsed with a rhythmic, low-pitched crackle, the embers glowing like the eyes of a buried dragon beneath the shifting white ash. The light cast by the fire was not constant. It breathed with the draught, stretching long, spindly shadows across the dirt floor, and causing the intricate carvings on the high-seat pillars to dance and shift. Here, a wooden serpent seemed to coil and uncoil along a beam. There, the face of a forgotten ancestor blinked in and out of existence as the flames flickered. Bjorn stood for a moment in the entryway, his eyes adjusting to the dimness, feeling the sudden, intense prickle of returning circulation in his wind-chinned cheeks and the tips of his weathered ears. He set the string of silver-scaled fish onto a low wooden bench near the door. the scales glinting one last time in the firelight like spilled coins before he moved toward the heat. Across the long hall, the members of his household were immersed in the quiet, meditative rhythms of the evening. Near the midsection of the hearth, Helga, his daughter by British, sat on a bench draped in the thick, coarse fur of a mountain goat. Her movements were slow and deliberate, governed by the economy of long practice. In her hands, she held a wide, shallow bowl of turned birchwood and a small, iron-bladed knife. She was slicing thin ribbons of dried white fish, the rhythmic scritch-tap of the blade against the wood providing a percussive counterpoint to the sighing wind outside. Beside her, a young boy, Bjorn's grandson, was hunched over a piece of stiffened leather, a bone all held firmly in his small, determined hand. He was mending a tear in a bootstrap, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pushed the needle through the stubborn hide. His shadow projected onto the wall behind him in an oversized, flickering silhouette. There was no urgency in their work. It was the steady, quiet maintenance of a life lived in harmony with the seasons, a preparation for the morrow that began long before the sun had even thought of rising. Bjorn moved closer to the fire, his boots silent on the packed earth floor which had been beaten hard by generations of footsteps and occasionally strewn with fresh rushes to keep the dampness at bay. He felt the radiant heat of the stones reaching out to him, a dry, penetrating warmth that began to draw the deep-seated ache from his joints. He sat heavily on a low stool carved from a stump, his hands outstretched toward the embers, his fingers thickened by work and scarred by the friction of hempen ropes, looked like the gnarled roots of an oak tree in the orange light. He watched the way the firelight played across the iron tools hanging from the crossbeams, a heavy cauldron hook, a pair of fire tongs, and a small, serrated saw, all of them coated in a fine patina of soot and grease that protected them from the creeping rust of the sea air. Everything in this space had a purpose, a history, and a place. The very walls seemed to exhale a sense of profound, unshakable permanence. "The wind is turning toward the mountains," Helga said softly, her voice low and melodic, barely rising above the crackle of the birch logs. She did not look up from her work, her fingers continuing their nimble dance with the dried fish. The goats were restless as the light faded. They smell the snow on the high peaks. Bjorn nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on a small pocket of blue flame dancing atop a knot of wood. "Aye," he replied, his own voice gravelly and worn. The tide was slow to turn this evening. The water felt heavy, like lead against the hull. The herring are moving deeper, seeking the warmer currents before the ice gates close in the north. They spoke in the shorthand of those who live by the grace of the elements. Their conversation a gentle exchange of observations rather than a debate. It was a verbal weaving, a way of anchoring themselves to the reality of the land and the sea while the world outside grew dark and cold. As the evening deepened, the scent of the stew, a thick, hearty concoction of pearled barley, dried roots, and the fatty trimmings of salted pork began to dominate the room. Helga rose with a fluid grace and moved to the cauldron that hung from a soot-blackened iron chain over the center of the fire. She took a long-handled wooden ladle and stirred the mixture, the steam rising in a thick, fragrant cloud that momentarily obscured her face. The sound of the bubbling liquid was a wet, rhythmic thumpis, a culinary heartbeat that promised sustenance. She filled a deep wooden bowl and handed it to Bjorn, the warmth of the wood transferring immediately to his palms. Beside it, she placed a thick slab of barley bread, its crust dark and hard, smelling of the stone oven and the wild yeast of the valley. Bjorn took a piece of the bread and broke it. the sound a dry, satisfying snap. The interior of the loaf was dense and chewy, flavored with the slight bitterness of the barley and the crunch of toasted husks. He dipped the bread into the stew, letting it soak up the rich, savory broth until it was soft. The first bite was an explosion of simple, grounding flavors, the saltiness of the pork, the sweetness of the softened carrots, and the earthy, nut-like quality of the grain. It was more than just food. It was the accumulation of a season's labor, a concentrated essence of the earth's bounty stored against the coming winter. He ate slowly, savoring the way the heat of the broth spread from his chest to his extremities, chasing away the last lingering ghosts of the North Sea's chill. Across from him, the boy had set down his awl and was now eating with the singular, quiet focus of the young, his wooden spoon clicking rhythmically against the side of his bowl. The longhouse seemed to shrink around them, the vastness of the northern night pressing against the thick timber walls, yet unable to penetrate the sanctuary of the hearth. Bjorn leaned back against a vertical support beam, feeling the rough texture of the bark and the coolness of the wood that was further from the fire. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sensory details of the room wash over him. He heard the muffled, rhythmic brush of the wind as it swept over the shaggy turf of the roof, a sound like a giant cat purring in its sleep. Occasionally, a piece of wood in the wall would settle with a sharp, echoing crack, a reminder that the house was a living thing, expanding and contracting with the temperature. From the far end of the hall, where the sleeping platforms were nestled behind thick woolen curtains, he heard the soft, steady breathing of the younger children, a fragile, precious sound that stood in stark contrast to the immense, indifferent silence of the mountains outside. The shadows on the ceiling continued their slow, hypnotic dance. Bjorn watched a particular knot in the overhead beam, wondering how many generations of his kin had looked upon that same mark as they sat by this same fire. There was a profound sense of continuity in the thought, a feeling that he was merely one link in a long, unbreakable chain of men and women who had carved a life out of this rugged coast. The iron tools on the wall glinted occasionally, catching a stray spark, their silhouettes looking like ancient runes cast in shadow. Everything felt heavy, solid, and certain. The weight of the woolen blankets on the benches, the thickness of the timber walls, the heat of the fire-it all combined to create a sense of absolute security, a fortress of light held against the encroaching dark. Outside, the world was undergoing its own quiet transformation. The initial calm of the evening was giving way to a new phase of the coastal cycle. Bjorn, even within the thick walls of the longhouse, could feel the shift. His ears, tuned by years of survival to the subtle frequencies of the landscape, picked up a change in the voice of the sea. The gentle hush of the waves against the pebbles was beginning to deepen into a more resonant, guttural thrum. It was a vibration felt in the soles of the feet more than heard in the ears, the unmistakable signal that the tide had completed its retreat and was now beginning its slow, inexorable march back toward the land. The water would be rising now, swirling around the barnacle-crusted pilings of the small pier, creeping up the hulls of the beached boats and filling the tide pools with fresh, cold life from the deep. The golden glow of the hearth fire, while still pulsing with a steady, visceral heat, had begun to recede into the corners of the longhouse, allowing the deep, cobalt shadows of the night to reclaim the periphery of the room. The transition from the active warmth of the meal to the profound stillness of the late hour was marked by a change in the very texture of the silence. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but a heavy, layered quietude. filled with the synchronized breathing of those resting upon the raised wooden platforms. The thick woolen curtains, dyed with the muted browns of walnut husks and the soft greens of lichen, hung motionless, serving as soft barriers between the communal space and the private dreams of the household. Inside this timber cocoon, the world felt localized and small, a tiny pocket of human warmth suspended in the vast, freezing architecture of the north. Yet, beyond the thick sod walls and the heavy oak door, the fjord was undergoing a magnificent, silent transformation. The moon, a pale and frosted orb, had climbed above the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains, casting a spill of liquid silver across the expanse of the water. This light was not the warm, forgiving amber of the sun. It was a sharp, clinical brilliance that turned the dark surface of the sea into a moving mosaic of mercury and ink. Each ripple, driven by the invisible hand of the rising tide, caught the moonlight for a fleeting second, shimmering with a cold fire before dissolving back into the indigo depths. The water did not crash. It breathed. It was a slow, deliberate inhalation that brought the sea closer to the village. The line of white foam creeping higher up the pebbled beach with a sound like the tearing of fine silk dot down at the water's edge. The fishing boats, which had seemed so solid and immobile during the day, began to respond to this lunar summons. As the tide reached their sterns, the hulls groaned softly, a sound of wood shifting against stone. The moisture-laden ropes that tethered them to heavy, barnacle-encrusted boulders began to tighten. There was a rhythmic, percussive quality to the tenshina low-frequency thrum as the hempen fibers were pulled taut by the buoyancy of the ships, followed by the wet, rhythmic slap of the water hitting the clinker-built planks. The pebbles on the beach, smoothed by eons of such encounters, shifted and rolled over one another as the water retreated and advanced, creating a constant, rattling murmur that served as the heartbeat of the cove. To the uninitiated, this might have sounded like a warning, but to the folk of the village, it was the most fundamental of lullabies. Inside the longhouse, tucked away in a corner where the scent of dried herbs hung thick from the rafters, a young boy named Eric lay, wide-eyed, against the coarse grain of a reindeer hide. While the rest of the household had succumbed to the heavy, dreamless sleep of the weary, his mind remained as restless as the shifting tide. The air in the loft was warm and smelled of woodsmoke and old wool, a comfort that usually acted as a weight upon his eyelids, but tonight the call of the outside was too persistent to ignore. He listened to the rhythmic whistle of his grandfather's breath and the soft rustle of straw beneath his mother's blanket. Every sound was magnified in the stillness, the occasional pop of a cooling ember in the hearth, the scratch of a mouse in the grain store, the groan of the central pillar as it held the weight of the turf roof. With the practiced stealth of a hunter, Eric slid his legs from beneath the heavy furs. The movement was agonizingly slow, his muscles tense to prevent the wooden slats of the platform from creaking. His feet, small but already toughened by summers of running barefoot through the heather, found the edge of the platform and lowered him to the dirt floor. The ground was cool here, away from the hearth, a dampness rising from the earth that made the soles of his feet tingle. He moved past the sleeping figures, his shadow a flickering ghost on the soot-stained walls. He reached the heavy door, his small hand finding the iron latch. He pressed it down with a slow, deliberate pressure, wincing as the metal gave a faint, rhythmic click. He pulled the door just wide enough to slip through. A sliver of the outside world cutting through the amber gloom like a blade of ice. As he stepped over the threshold, the change in temperature was immediate and shocking, a sharp, crystalline slap of air that seemed to scour the lingering warmth of the hearth from his skin. He did not shiver. Instead, he stood still, drawing in a long, deep breath of the night. The air was remarkably clear, devoid of the heaviness of smoke and the musk of animals. It tasted of salt, of frozen pine needles, and of the immense, open emptiness of the great sea. The village was unrecognizable in the moonlight. The turf roofs were no longer green, but a shimmering, frosted silver, and the shadows between the houses were deep. Impenetrable voids. Eric began to walk toward the shore, his bare feet sinking into the frost-dried grass before finding the first of the smooth, round pebbles. The stones were biting cold, a sharp sensation that travelled up his legs and sharpened his senses. He moved with a quiet, swaying gait, balancing himself against the uneven ground as he made his way toward the silhouette of an overturned rowboat that sat near the high-water mark. The smell of the sea grew thicker with every step, a pungent, bracing aroma of wet kelp, crushed shells, and the clean, metallic temps of deep water. It was a smell that spoke of distance, of mystery, and of the relentless cycle of life and death that played out beneath the waves. He reached the boat and sat on the cold, salt-crusty wood of the hull, pulling his knees up to his chest and wrapping his thin woolen tunic around his shins. Above him, the sky was a vast, inverted bowl of velvet, so crowded with stars that it seemed there was more light than darkness. These were the constellations his grandfather had taught him to read as if they were lines carved into a map. He saw the great Wain, its wheels turning slowly around the unmoving point of the North Star, the steady light that guided the longships home when the landmarks of the coast were lost to the fog. He saw the glittering belt of the Hunter and the faint, misty smudge of the Starpather, great river of light that the elders said was the bridge between the worlds. In the clarity of the northern night, the stars did not just twinkle. They burned with a steady, ancient intensity, indifferent to the small, breathing village below. The relationship between his people and this water was not one of conquest or of fear. It was a profound, unspoken companionship. The sea was the provider, the great mother that filled their nets with silver and their larders with meat. But she was also a stern mistress who demanded respect and an unwavering awareness of her moods. To a Viking, the sea was not a barrier to be overcome, but a highway to be travelled, a living extension of the land itself. They did not romanticize the waves, for they knew the weight of the water and the bite of the gale, yet they did not shun them. Every boat pulled onto this shore was a promise of return, a testament to the belief that the horizon was not an end, but a beginning. Eric felt this connection in his very marrow. The rhythmic pull of the tide seemed to echo the pulse in his own wrists. As he sat there, the silence was punctuated by the distant, haunting cry of a black-backed gull, a lonely sound that echoed off the cliffs and faded into the mist. Somewhere further out in the fjord, he heard a heavy splash perhaps, a seal surfacing to breathe, or a large fish jumping in the moonlight. The sound rippled through the stillness, a reminder that even when the humans slept, the world remained vibrantly, dangerously alive. The water was now within a few paces of his feet, the foam bubbling between the stones with a soft, persistent hiss. He watched the way the moonlight played on the crests of the small waves. Mesmerized by the infinite variety of the patterns, the boy leaned his head back against the rough, tarred wood of the boat, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark sea met the star-strewn sky. He felt small, yet strangely significant, a tiny observer of a grand, celestial clockwork. The cold of the stones and the bite of the wind no longer felt like intrusions. They were simply the conditions of his existence, the raw materials of his life. He listened to the sea breathe hush, rattle, sigh, a cycle that had continued for 1,000 years before his birth and would continue for 1,000 years after he was gone. The village behind him remained a cluster of silent, smoking mounds, a fortress of sleep in a world of silver and salt. The tide continued its slow, inexorable climb, the water now kissing the very edge of the pebbles near his toes. It was a cold, wet benediction, a reminder that the sea was always coming home to the land. Eric closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the world more clearly. He felt the vibration of the waves in the wood of the boat, the scent of the coming winter in the air, and the vast, unblinking presence of the stars overhead. The night was far from over, and the tide had yet to reach its zenith. But in this moment, on the edge of the world, there was a profound and absolute peace. The boy, Eric, remained perched on the cold, tarred hull of the rowboat, his small chest rising and falling in an unconscious mimicry of the tide's slow, deliberate respiration. The water had reached its near maximum, and the sound of the pebbles rolling back into the depths was like the clicking of thousands of tiny, polished teeth. It was a texture of sound that seemed to vibrate through the wood of the boat and into his very bones, anchoring him to the shoreline. The moonlight continued to wash over the cove in waves of brilliant, icy silver, turning the wet stones into gems and the foam into a delicate lace that lived for only a second before the earth drank it back. In this profound stillness, every sound carried with it a weight of significance, and so, when the first faint crunch of a footstep echoed from the path leading down to the village, Eric did not jump. Instead, he simply turned his head, his senses sharpened by the cold, to watch a shadow detach itself from the gloom of the longhouses. The footsteps were slow, measured, and carried a rhythmic, shuffling quality that spoke of long years spent navigating the uneven terrain of the coast. As the figure drew closer, the moonlight began to peel away the layers of shadow, revealing the familiar, sturdy form of his grandmother, Inga. She was wrapped in a cloak of undyed wool, so thick and heavy that it seemed to absorb the starlight rather than reflect it. The fabric was coarse, woven with the tight, waterproof tension of those who know the cruelty of a sudden sleet storm. As she approached, the scent of the house followed her, a faint, lingering ghost of woodsmoke, dried hyssop, and the milky, fermented temps of the morning's churn. She didn't speak at first. She simply walked to the edge of the overturned boat, her breath forming small, fleeting clouds of mist that silvered in the air before vanishing into the night. Eric watched the moonlight catch the long, silver strands of her hair, which had escaped from the confines of her head wrap. They looked like filaments of spun glass, shimmering against the dark backdrop of the mountain. With a slow, deliberate series of movements, she reached out a hand spotted with age and gnarled like the roots of the shore pines, rested it on the wood of the boat to steady herself. She lowered her body onto the hull beside him, her joints giving a faint, dry creak that was lost in the sigh of a receding wave. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked out at the fjord, her eyes narrowed with the habit of a lifetime spent, searching the horizon for a change in the wind or the flash of a leaping school of fish. The silence between them was not a void to be filled, but a shared space, as comfortable and heavy as the woolen blankets in the hall. "The moon has a sharp edge tonight," she said eventually, her voice a low, raspy murmur that felt like the rustle of dry leaves. It was a grounded sound, devoid of the high-pitched urgency of the day. "Look at the way the light sits on the water. Eric, when the silver is wide and flat like a frozen lake, the deep currents are resting. But see there, near the mouth of the fjord, where the light breaks into 1,000 tiny splinters. That is the tide wrestling with the fresh water from the mountain streams. It is a slow struggle tonight. The sea is winning, but it is taking its time. She gestured with a blunt finger toward the distant opening of the cove. Eric followed her gaze, seeing for the first time the subtle differences in the water's texture that he had previously ignored. To him, it had just been light. To her, it was a ledger of the sea's intent. Inga adjusted the heavy fold of her cloak, drawing it tighter around her shoulders. A fisherman who does not know the moon is a fisherman who will find his nets empty and his boat high on the rocks. She continued, her gaze shifting upward to the pale, luminous orb. The moon is the shepherd of the water. It pulls the tide in and pushes it out, just as a woman draws a thread through the loom. You can feel it in your blood if you sit still enough. Tomorrow, the tide will be even higher, and the morning mist will cling to the water until the sun is 3 handspans above the peaks. I can smell the dampness growing in the back of the wind, not a storm wind, but a heavy, quiet wind that brings the low clouds. They will be thick tomorrow, like the fleece of a sheep that hasn't been shorn in 3 seasons. It will be a day for the shore nets, not for the deep water lines. Eric listened, his eyes fixed on the shifting patterns of the silver splinters she had pointed out. He felt the cold of the boat hull seeping through his tunic, but the presence of his grandmother provided a different kind of warmth, a psychological heat that came from her immense, lived-in certainty. She spoke of the weather not as a mystery to be feared or a spirit to be appeased, but as a series of practical observations. She described how the clouds would thicken from the north, losing their sharp edges and becoming a soft, grey blanket that would mute the sound of the oars. She told him how to watch the way the gulls behaved in the first light if they stayed near the cliffs. The wind would stay high, but if they settled on the water, the day would be still and productive. It was a lesson in patience, in the necessity of waiting for the world to reveal its path before setting out upon it. Patience is the strongest tool in a man's chest, she murmured, her eyes drifting back to the stars. Better to sit on this boat and watch the tide than to fight a sea that isn't ready to give up its secrets. The water has no memory of our struggles, Eric. It only knows its own rhythm. We are the ones who must learn to dance to it. They sat in a long, profound silence after that. The only sounds were the environmental ones, the rhythmic clack-slap of the rising water, the distant, hollow boom of a wave hitting a sea cave further down the coast, and the soft, steady whistle of Inga's breath. The sky above them seemed to deepen in its indigo intensity, the stars becoming sharper, more crystalline, high above the mountain ridges to the north. A faint ethereal shimmer began to manifest. It wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, ghostly blooming of lighter veil of pale green and translucent violet that seemed to ripple like a curtain caught in a draught. It was the aurora, the northern light that danced over the world when the air was coldest and the sky most clear. It didn't illuminate the ground. It only added a sense of immense, vertical scale to the night. It reflected in the broken starlight of the fjord, making the water look as though it were filled with emerald dust. Neither of them spoke of it. It was simply a part of the night's architecture, as expected as the frost or the tide. They watched the green ribbons twist and fold, a silent celestial ballet that made the village below seem even smaller and more fragile than before. The silence stretched out, punctuated only by the occasional shift of a pebble under the pressure of the tide. The water was now at its peak, lapping at the very edge of the rowboat's resting place. Inga reached out and took Eric's hand. Her skin was rough, mapped with 1,000 tiny lines, but her grip was firm and grounding. "The tide has reached its height," she said softly. "It will hold its breath for a moment, and then it will begin the long walk back to the deep. And we should do the same. The hearth has cooled, but the stones will still hold enough heat to keep the chill from the blankets. The morning will come early, and the nets won't mend themselves while we sit here counting stars." She rose first, with a slow, grunting effort that spoke of the weight of her years. She waited for Eric to stand, her hand still holding his. As they turned back toward the village, the landscape felt different. The initial sharp excitement of the night had settled into a heavy, comfortable fatigue. They walked slowly back over the pebbles, their footsteps muted by the dampness. The grass of the village common was now white with a fine, delicate lace of frost, each blade standing stiff and crystalline in the moonlight. The turf roofs of the longhouses looked like mounds of fallen snow, the green of the sod completely hidden beneath the frozen breath of the night. As they moved between the houses, the silence was absolute. The smoke from the roof holes had thinned to almost nothing, a mere ghost of a trail that vanished into the star-filled sky. There were no voices, no sounds of movement from within the dwellings, only the deep, communal sleep of a village that lived by the sun and the tide. They passed the blacksmith's forge, the anvil a dark, unyielding shape in the shadows. They passed the drying racks, where the fish hung like silver pendants in the moonlight, brittle and cold. The village felt like a place outside of time, a collection of timber and stone and turf that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. They reached the door of their longhouse. Inga paused, looking back one last time at the cove. The aurora had faded back into a faint, greenish glow on the horizon, and the moon was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. The shoreline was empty once again, the rowboat a dark silhouette against the shimmering water. The sea had begun its retreat, the pebbles rattling as the water pulled back, revealing the wet, glistening skin of the earth once more. It was a cycle of endless repetition, a cosmic clock that governed every aspect of their lives. Inga pushed the heavy door open. The interior of the longhouse was dark, the fire having subsided into a bed of deep pulsing orange embers that cast a soft, rhythmic glow across the room. The air was thick and still, carrying the warmth of the day's labors. They slipped inside, the heavy thud of the door closing behind them, acting as a final punctuation to the night. The village remained suspended in that deep, hollow silence that exists only in the hours when the moon has passed its zenith, but the sun has not yet begun to contemplate the horizon. In this profound stillness, the landscape itself seems to breathe with a more resonant, elemental voice. Along the crescent of the cove, the small fleet of fishing boats lies in a state of suspended animation, their dark, tarred hulls angled against the sloping shingle like the wings of resting birds. The tide, having reached its greatest height, has now begun its slow and deliberate retreat, and as it pulls back toward the center of the fjord, the environment transforms into a delicate theater of mechanical and organic sound. Each boat, built from overlapping planks of seasoned oak and pine, reacts to the shifting water with a unique, rhythmic signature. As the buoyancy beneath the keels lessens, the hulls settle deeper into the wet pebbles with a grinding, subterranean rumble that is felt more than heard. The wooden frames, soaked through with the brine of the day's work and then chilled by the freezing night air, undergo a subtle process of contraction. In the absolute quiet, one can hear the faint crystalline ping of the wood fibers tightening, a series of minute groans and snaps that echo through the hollow chambers of the vessels dot between the boats. The water slides back toward the sea with a liquid, whispering grace, weaving through the gaps in the smooth stones with a soft, bubbling hiss. This is the sound of the earth's respiration, a constant, low-frequency pulse that governs the life of the village. The moisture on the holes, which had previously glistened in the moonlight, is now beginning to turn into a fine, white rime of frost. The tiny ice crystals form in the grain of the wood, creating a matte, ghostly texture that blurs the sharp lines of the prows. Where two boats rest close together, their gunwales occasionally make contact as they rock in the ebbing current, a soft, wooden talk that resonates like a heartbeat across the empty beach. This knocking of wood against wood is a comforting sound, a reminder of the craftsmanship that holds the village together, a testament to the strength of the timber that stands between the men and the deep, cold hunger of the fjord. The ropes, too, are part of this nocturnal symphony. The thick, hempen tethers, heavy with salt and frozen spray, pull taut and then slacken with a rhythmic, percussive thrum. One can hear the individual fibers rubbing against one another, a dry, raspy sound that speaks of tension and release, of the constant struggle to remain anchored while the world is in motion. In the midst of this, mechanical dialogue between boat and sea, a soft, scraping sound emerges from the direction of the long. It is the sound of heavy leather boots meeting the frost-slicked earth. Two figures emerge from the deep shadows cast by the turf-roofed dwellings, their forms barely distinguishable from the dark backdrop of the cliffs. These are the early watchers, seasoned fishermen whose bodies have become so attuned to the rhythm of the tides that they wake without the need for light. They move with a slow, swaying gait, their joints stiff from the cold but their movements purposeful and practiced. They are dressed in multiple layers of heavy, undyed wool tunics worn over shirts of softer linen, topped with thick felted cloaks that are pinned at the shoulder with simple iron brooches. As they step onto the beach, their breath precedes them in large, rolling clouds of silver vapor, each exhalation a brief, ghostly lantern in the dark air. They do not carry torches. Their eyes have long since adjusted to the moonlight, and they navigate the maze of boats and nets by touch and memory. The first man, a barrel-chested elder named Thorsten, approaches the largest of the fishing boats, a sturdy vessel with a high, elegant prow. He moves with a deliberate slowness, his boots crunching rhythmically on the wet pebbles. He reaches out a hand, his fingers thick and calloused, and runs them along the curve of the hull. The wood is bitingly cold, the frost transferring to his skin in an instant, but he does not pull away. He is testing the moisture, feeling for any new cracks that might have been forced open by the evening's freeze. His touch is as light as a musician's on a string, sensitive to the slightest imperfection in the tarred surface. Beside him, the younger man, Leaf, bends down to inspect the stone anchor. He checks the knot where the heavy rope meets the iron-bound stone, his fingers dancing over the wet, frozen fibers with the dexterity of a weaver. He pulls the knot tight, feeling the resistance of the hemp, ensuring that the ebb tide will not drag the boat into the deeper, swifter currents of the fjord's mouth. They move from ship to ship, their presence a quiet, almost invisible addition to the night's landscape. There is no urgency in their work, only a deep-seated commitment to the safety of the fleet. Thorsten reaches into the belly of a smaller rowboat and lifts an oar from its rest. He runs his hand down the length of the shaft, checking for splinters or warping. The oar is heavy, the wood seasoned by years of immersion in salt water, and as he rotates it in the oarlock, the metal gives a faint, rhythmic squeak that carries clearly across the water. He adjusts the placement of the oar, ensuring it is balanced and ready for the first man who will take the bench at dawn. He then turns his attention to the nets, which hang from the drying racks like the veils of a giant. He reaches out and lifts a section of the hempen mesh, letting the weight of it rest in his palm. It is still damp, the water having retreated into the center of the knots, but the frost has made the fibers stiff. He gently shakes the net, listening to the dry, rattling sound. It makes a sound like falling leaves before carefully smoothing it back into place. The current will be pulling hard to the west by the time the light breaks. Leaf murmurs, his voice so low it is almost lost in the sound of the waves. He is standing at the stern of a boat, looking out at the dark, glass-like surface of the fjord. Thorsten joins him, his gaze following Leif's out toward the open sea. "Aye," Thorsten replies, the sound of his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that seems to come from his chest rather than his throat. The moon is pulling the deep water. "We'll have to row a league further north before we drop the lines if we want to catch the drift correctly. The water is cold enough to make the herring sluggish." They'll be huddling in the lee of the great cliff. They stand there for several minutes, two silhouettes against the shimmering water, contemplating the unseen movements of the deep. Their conversation is minimal, a series of observations honed by decades of shared labor. They speak not of the beauty of the night, but of the weight of the water, the thickness of the morning mist, and the predictable behavior of the fish. Leaf reaches down and picks up a handful of pebbles, letting them slip through his fingers back onto the beach. The sound is a sharp, percussive rattle that punctuates the silence. "The wind is holding in the mountains," he says, nodding toward the dark, jagged peaks that loom over the village. "It will stay quiet for the launch, but we'll feel the bite of the north once we're past the headlands." Thorsten nods, his eyes fixed on a distant ripple that catches the moonlight. They spend another long period simply standing still, absorbing the information the environment is providing. They are listening to the frequency of the waves, feeling the temperature of the air against their faces, and smelling the subtle shifts in the scent of the sea. To them, the night is not a time of darkness, but a time of clarity. A period when the distractions of the day are stripped away and the true nature of the coast is revealed. Eventually, the inspection is complete. Every knot has been tested, every hole felt, and every oar checked. The two men begin their walk back toward the village, their boots making that same rhythmic, crunching sound on the shingle. As they transition from the pebbles to the frost-covered grass of the path, the sound of their movement softens. They pass by the longhouses, their figures becoming more indistinct as they move further away from the moonlit shoreline. One by one, they disappear into the deep, velvet shadows of the eaves. The soft thud of a door closing, marking their return to the warmth of the hearth. The village is once again a collection of silent, shaggy mounds, its inhabitants tucked away in the safety of the turf walls, unaware of the quiet vigil that has just been kept. The shoreline is left to its own devices once again. The boats, now meticulously prepared for the coming labor, continue their gentle, rhythmic rocking in the ebbing tide. The sound of the water has grown slightly fuller as more of the beach is exposed, the rattling of the pebbles becoming more consistent and melodic. The frost continues to grow on the wood and the stone, a delicate, crystalline armor that protects the village from the heat of the coming day. The moon, now lower in the sky, casts long, distorted shadows across the cove, making the prows of the boats look like the heads of great serpents emerging from the dark earth. Everything is in its place. The nets are ready, the hulls are sound, and the sea continues its ancient, unhurried retreat. The deep night still holds its sway over the north, a period of profound and absolute stillness where the only movement is the slow pulse of the tide and the silent, shimmering dance of the stars in the dark water of the fjord. The world is waiting, held in a cold, silver embrace, for the cycle to turn once more. Inside the adjacent longhouse, situated slightly further up the slope where the earth begins its ascent toward the granite cliffs, the atmosphere is a thick, resonant pool of amber and indigo. Here, the passage of time is measured not by the movement of the moon, but by the slow, rhythmic consumption of birchwood logs in the central hearth. A woman named Astrid sits on a low, three-legged stool near the edge of the stone-lined pit, her body angled to catch the flickering warmth of the flames. Before her, a massive fishing net of heavy, dark-dyed hemp spills across her lap and onto the rush-strewn floor like a gargantuan, tangled shadow. The fire is in its long, middle-night phase, the bright, snapping yellow flames of the evening having matured into a deep, pulsing orange glow that radiates a dry, penetrating heat. Occasionally, a pocket of trapped sap in the birchwood ignites with a sharp, percussive pop, sending a momentary fountain of sparks spiraling upward toward the square smoke hole in the roof, where they vanish into the cold, starry void beyond. The smoke itself does not rise in a hurried stream. It curls and eddies in lazy, languid loops, clinging to the soot-stained rafters and the hanging bundles of dried mugwort and sage before being drawn out by the gentle vacuum of the night air. The interior of this space is a sanctuary of sensory layers, each one contributing to the profound sense of grounded continuity. There is the persistent, underlying scent of the sea sharp, saline temps that has been baked into the very grain of the timber pillars and the woolen hangings. It mingles with the more immediate smells of the household, the musky, animal warmth of the sheepskins lining the sleeping benches, the oily richness of the tallow lamp burning on a wall niche, and the clean, woody aroma of the birch fire. As Astrid works, the light of the hearth plays across the surfaces of the room, turning the carved dragon heads on the high seat, pillars into breathing entities that seem to watch over the slumbering household. The shadows are long and soft-edged, moving with the slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of the fire's heart, stretching across the dirt floor and climbing the vertical oak planks of the walls until they merge with the darkness of the high ceiling. Astrid's hands move with a mechanical, hypnotic precision that is born of a lifetime of repetition. The hemp fibers of the net are rough and abrasive, having been toughened by constant exposure to salt water and the abrasive friction of the boat's gunnels. Between her fingers, the cord feels like weathered stone, yet there is a subtle flexibility to it that she navigates with practiced ease. She holds a small, smoothed needle made of whalebone, its surface polished to a high sheen by years of contact with the oil in the hemp. With each movement, she identifies a frayed knot or a small tear where a particularly large catch or a sharp piece of seafloor debris has breached the mesh. She loops the cord, pulls it through with a steady, even pressure, and cinches the knot tight. The sound of this labor is a soft, rhythmic hisknup, a percussive whisper that fills the quiet intervals between the crackling of the logs. It is a meditative rhythm, a cadence that requires no conscious thought, allowing her mind to settle into a state of quiet. Observational awareness. She examines the net with a critical eye, her thumb tracing the geometry of the diamonds she creates. Each knot must be identical to its neighbor. Any inconsistency would create a point of weakness that the sea would surely find and exploit. This is the unseen labor that serves as the foundation of the village's survival. For every hour the men spend on the water, pulling oars against the resistance of the fjord, or hauling heavy lines from the deep, there are countless hours spent here, in the dim light of the hearth, tending to the tools of their trade. It is a quiet, unspoken cooperation, a social contract written in hemp and timber. The village exists as a single, breathing organism, where the mending of a net is just as vital as the steering of the ship. Astrid finds a certain peace in this repetition. There is a profound safety in the predictability of the task. A sense that as long as the knots are tight and the hearth is warm, the world remains in its proper order. The silence of the house is punctuated by the soft, rhythmic breathing of her children in the sleeping alcoves, their presence felt as a gentle pressure against the stillness. Occasionally, a beam in the roof will settle with a deep, echoing groan, reacting to the gradual cooling of the night air. Outside the thick walls, the environment continues its slow, nocturnal shift. The wind, which had been a steady, invisible presence from the north, begins to veer slightly toward the mountains, carrying with it a sharper, drier chill. It brushes against the shaggy turf of the roof with a sound like a heavy cloak dragging over dry grass. Down at the shoreline, the tide has reached its low ebb mark, revealing the slick, dark surfaces of the kelp-covered rocks that remain hidden for most of the day. A distant seabird, perhaps a lone petrel or a restless gull amidst a single, haunting cry that echoes off the granite cliffs and carries across the water a thin, fragile thread of sound that eventually unravels into the vast silence of the fjord. Astrid pauses her work, the bone needle resting against her palm. She closes her eyes and tilts her head slightly, listening. Through the thick, earth-insulated walls of the longhouse, the voice of the sea is reduced to a low-frequency vibration, a deep oceanic hum that resonates in the floorboards. She can hear the rhythmic thumpis of the swells as they collapse against the distant headlands, a sound that is both immense and intimate. She thinks of the boats resting on the shingle, the hulls cooling in the frost, and the men who will soon be waking to face the cold grey of the morning. There is no anxiety in this reflection, only a grounded acceptance of the cycle. The sea is a constant neighbour, an entity that must be watched and understood, but never fully conquered. She returns to her mending, the hiss-snap of the cord resuming its steady pace. She works her way through a complex section of the net, where 3 diamonds meet at a central point. The concentration required for this specific repair draws her focus even deeper, narrowing her world down to the texture of the hemp and the flickering orange light on her knuckles. The fire begins to settle, the logs collapsing into a bed of white ash and glowing red embers. The heat remains intense, but the light has softened, turning the interior of the longhouse into a cavern of deep, velvety shadows. The carved beams overhead are now mere silhouettes, their intricate details lost to the gloom. The smell of the smoke has changed, becoming heavier and more mineral as the wood reaches the final stages of its combustion. As she nears the end of the section she intended to finish, Astrid feels the weight of the night pressing more heavily upon her. The labor has served its purpose, anchoring her through the deepest hours of the dark. She loops the final thread, cinches the last knot with a firm, decisive pull, and runs her hand over the repaired area. It is smooth, strong, and ready for the tension of the fjord. She sets the bone needle into its small leather sheath and slowly gathers the heavy net into a neat, organized coil. The weight of the hemp is substantial, a physical manifestation of the day's potential. She places the coil on the bench beside her, smoothing the fibers one last time before standing to stretch her cramped limbs. Her joints give a soft, dry click, and she feels the chill of the air away from the hearth settle onto her shoulders. Before moving toward her sleeping platform, she pauses by the central fire. She takes a heavy iron poker and gently pushes the remaining embers together, concentrating the heat so that it will last until the first stirrings of the dawn. The orange glow intensifies for a moment, illuminating her face and the silver threads in her hair, before subsiding back into a quiet, pulsing rhythm. The house feels incredibly still now, a timber-framed island in the middle of a cold, indifferent sea. The sounds from outside, the shifting wind, the distant water, the cooling earthals seem to merge into a single, cohesive tapestry of sound that cradles the village. Astrid stands for a moment, looking toward the heavy oak door. She can sense the cold on the other side, the frost-whitened grass and the silent, silver-lit fjord. But here, within the walls, the air is stagnant and warm, protected by the labor of the day and the history of the house. She moves with quiet, ghost-like steps toward the sleeping curtains, her feet finding the familiar, worn patches of the floor by instinct, as she slips behind the heavy woolen drape. The sound of the sea seems to grow fuller in the silence, a constant, rhythmic reminder of the world that waits beyond the threshold. The fire in the hearth settles lower still, the embers winking out one by one, leaving only the deep, pulsing heat and the slow, steady breath of the rising tide to keep watch over the sleeping village. The stillness that descends upon the village in the hour before the true midnight is a tangible, physical presence, a weight that seems to press the very spirit of the north into the frost-rimed earth. Outside the longhouses, the world has entered a state of crystalline stasis. The moisture that had clung to the massive, horizontal timber beams and the shaggy overhangs of the turf roofs has begun to pull itself together into delicate, microscopic architectures of ice. Each blade of grass on the roof mounds is now a stiff, silver needle, standing defiant against the cooling air. The sky above is an immense, unblinking vault of obsidian, crowded so densely with stars that they seem to hum with a low-frequency light. They do not merely twinkle, they pulse, white and blue and violet, rotating with an agonizingly slow, celestial gravity around the fixed point of the North Star. The fjord stretches out beyond the sheltering arms of the cove like a vast, hammered sheet of dark metal, its surface broken only by the rhythmic, liquid silver of the tide as it begins to creep back toward the land. The boats, pulled high on the shingle, are reduced to stark, ink-black silhouettes, their high prows reaching upward as if trying to hook the constellations that drift so tantalizingly close to the mountain peaks dot inside the longhouse. The environment is defined by the deep, resonant rhythm of collective rest. The fire in the central hearth has subsided into a sprawling bed of glowing charcoal, a landscape of miniature red canyons and white ash plateaus that radiates a soft, persistent warmth. Bjorn wakes, not from any sudden sound or intrusive thought, but with the natural, quiet ease of a man who has lived his life in accordance with the shifting light and the turning tide. There is no startle in his movement, only a slow, conscious return to the world of the living. He lies still for a long moment, feeling the immense heaviness of the hand-woven woolen blankets that press down on his chest. The wool is coarse and thick, smelling of the sheep that provided it and the many years of wood smoke it has absorbed. It is a comforting weight, an anchor that tethers him to the safety of the hall while the cold of the northern night stalks the perimeter of the timber walls. Around him, the air is filled with the rhythmic, soft whistling of sleepers, the high, thin breaths of his grandson, the deeper, more sonorous cadence of his quinna tapestry of sound that confirms the continuity of his household. With a slow, deliberate economy of motion, Bjorn pushes back the layers of wool and fur. The air in the hall, while much warmer than the outside, feels sharp against his skin as he emerges from the cocoon of his bedding. He swings his legs over the edge of the sleeping platform, his feet finding the cold, hard-packed earth of the floor. The dirt is dry and smooth, polished by generations of feet, and it provides a grounding sensation that helps him shrug off the last lingering veils of slumber. He stands, his tall frame uncurling in the gloom, his head nearly brushing the soot-darkened rafters. He moves through the longhouse with a ghost-like silence, his memory of the floors, every undulation guiding him past the benches and the cooling hearth without a single misstep. He reaches the heavy oak door and lifts the latch with a slow, steady pressure, preventing the iron from groaning. As he pulls the door open, just a handspan at first, a sliver of the midnight world slices into the amber dimness of the house, bringing with it a breath of air so cold it feels like a needle against his lungs. He steps over the threshold and into the open night, closing the door softly behind him. The air is startlingly pure, stripped of the heavy smells of the hearth and the musk of the hall. It is a thin, dry cold that tastes of salt, frozen pine needles, and the deep mineral essence of the mountains. As he draws in a long, slow breath, his exhalation forms a thick, rolling cloud of silver vapor that hangs in the air for a second before being dispersed by a faint, mountain-borne breeze. The smell of the village at midnight is subtle, the faint, lingering scent of dried cod from the racks, the earthy musk of the goat pens, and the sharp, clean bite of the frost as it settles on the stones. Bjorn walks a few paces away from the door, his boots making a crisp, crystalline sound on the frozen grass. He stops near the center of the village path, his hands tucked into the folds of his thick woolen tunic, and simply observes. The fjord is a masterpiece of light and shadow. The moon, hanging high and pale, casts a spill of brilliance across the water that looks like a path of crushed diamonds leading toward the open sea. Every ripple, driven by the slow, inexorable return of the tide, catches this light and holds it, creating a shimmering, liquid motion that contrasts with the absolute stillness of the land. Beyond the cove, the dark mass of the mountains looms against the stars, their jagged peaks outlined in a faint, ethereal glow. Bjorn looks at the water, not with the eyes of a dreamer, but with the practical, measured gaze of a navigator. He notes the way the tide is climbing the dark line of the rocks. He gauges the height of the moon and the position of the Great Bear rotating in the sky. To him, the stars are not distant mysteries. They are fixed points of a living map, the same stars that guided his father and his father's father through the treacherous fogs of the Western Islands. He reflects, with a calm and grounded clarity, on the many years he has spent upon this water. He remembers the bite of the salt spray against his face during the spring storms, the way the boat felt alive beneath his feet as it carved through the swells, and the profound, echoing silence of the deep-sea fishing grounds when the wind died down to a whisper. The coastline has remained constant, a rugged and unyielding companion to his life's labor. The cliffs do not change. The tides do not forget their schedule. There is a quiet endurance in this landscape that mirrors the endurance of his people. They are a folk carved from the same stone and seasoned by the same salt, bound to the rhythm of the seasons by a necessity that is as fundamental as breath. He watches alone, dark wave collapse against the shingle with a soft, rattling sigh, the pebbles rolling back into the depths with a sound like muted thunder. standing there in the center of the frozen village. Bjorn feels the immense scale of the north pressing in on him. He is a small figure in a vast architecture of stone and ice, yet he does not feel insignificant. He is part of the pattern, a thread in the weave of the coast. He thinks of the men who will rise in a few hours to push the boats into the surf, the women who will stir the fires and mend the nets, and the children who will eventually take up the oars. It is a cycle that transcends the individual, a long, unbroken chain of survival that stretches back into the mist of memory. He looks up at the sky one last time, watching the way the stars seem to drift across the peaks. A slow-motion dance that has been playing out since the world was first hewn from the ice. The cold begins to seep through his tunic, a steady, persistent reminder that he belongs to the warmth of the hall. He turns back toward the longhouse, his movements as unhurried as the tide. The frost has thickened on the wooden beams of the outbuildings, making them look as though they have been carved from salt. As he reaches the door, he pauses to look back at the cove. The shoreline is empty, the boats resting in their silver blue light, the sea breathing its slow, rhythmic hush. The village is a sanctuary of silence, a fortress of sleep held in the palm of the granite cliffs. He enters the house, the warmth of the cooling embers embracing him like a familiar cloak. He slides the latch into place, the sound of final, quiet punctuation to his midnight vigil. As he returns to the heaviness of his woolen blankets, the stars continue their slow, majestic rotation overhead, and the north remains held in its deep, silver-lit dream of frost and salt, waiting for the inevitable, slow approach of the dawn. The sky over the fjord has entered its most secretive phase, that hollow and hallowed hour where the deep obsidian of the midnight vault begins to lose its sharp, impenetrable edge. It is not yet light, but the darkness is no longer absolute. It has become a porous, living thing. High above the jagged, snow-dusted peaks, the stars that previously burned with a crystalline ferocity are starting to soften, their light smudging into the deepening indigo-like ink washing into clear water. The Great Bear has rotated further toward the western ridge, its guiding light now appearing as a faint silver pulse against the lightning canopy, along the easternmost edge of the world, where the mountains dip to meet the sea, a thin, tentative seam of pale blue and charcoal grey has begun to form a fragile, bruised line that marks the boundary between the dream state of the night and the waking reality of the morning. The moon, now a low, heavy orb of tarnished silver, has descended toward the mountainous horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that stretch across the village like the fingers of a retreating giant. The fjord itself, which for hours had been a mirror of ink, is transitioning into the color of cold. Beaten steel, its surface flat and heavy, reflecting the gathering grey of the upper atmosphere. In this deepest silence, the auditory world of the cove expands to fill the void. The tide has reached its fullest point, the water pushing up against the pebbled shoreline with a final, quiet insistence. It is a moment of high water equilibrium, where the sea is neither advancing nor retreating, but holding its breath against the land. The sound of the water is no longer a rattle, but a soft, rhythmic hush, the liquid sliding between the smooth, round stones and filling the crevices with a cold, salt-laden sigh. Occasionally, a single pebble, loosened by the water's weight, will shift and roll with a hollow, percussive click, a sound that carries with startling clarity through the frost-thickened air. Along the very edge of the tide line, where the fresh water of a mountain rill meets the saline surge of the sea, Thin sheets of ice that formed in the stillness begin to crackle. It is a sound like the breaking of glass needles, a delicate, high-pitched snapping that marks the subtle movement of the earth's cooling skin. From a high ledge of granite, a lone guillemot stirs in its nest, releasing a single, low-pitched croak that echoes off the cliff face before being swallowed by the immense, quiet weight of the air inside the long. The atmosphere of total dormancy is beginning to fracture into the first subtle movements of the coming day. The air remains heavy with the scent of cooling hearths and sheepskins, but the rhythm of the household is shifting. In the center of Bjorn's hall, a shadow moves toward the hearth. A woman, her form indistinct in the gloom, reaches into a basket of kindling. With a soft, dry rustle, she places a small piece of birch bark and a few slivers of dried pine onto the remaining red embers. The wood catches with a quiet, energetic crackle pop, a tiny fountain of orange sparks illuminating her hands for a fleeting second before the first thin, yellow flame licks upward. On the sleeping platforms, the texture of the sound changes. The heavy, rhythmic snoring of the deep night gives way to the rustle of wool blankets being pulled tighter or shifted aside. A wooden bowl is moved on a bench, making a soft, melodic thunk against the timber, and a low, muffled cough echoes from the far end of the hall, sounding deep and cavernous in the stillness. These are the small, domestic signals that the fortress of sleep is being disassembled. One quiet action at a time, Bjorn, lying in the dimness of his alcove, watches the first play of the new firelight against the rafters. His body, seasoned by decades of early launches, has anticipated the tide's turn before his mind has fully cleared the mists of rest. He moves with a slow, deliberate grace, respecting the silence of those still sleeping. He sits on the edge of the platform, the wood groaning only slightly beneath his wetter, familiar, companionable sound that he has heard every morning of his adult life. He reaches for his leg wraps, the thick woolen bands cold to the touch but heavy with the promise of insulation. He begins the process of binding them around his calves, his fingers moving with rhythmic certainty as he crosses the fabric over and over, tucking the ends securely. Every action is extended, a ritual of preparation that cannot be hurried. Next come his leather boots, the hide stiffened by the night's frost. He works the leather with his thumbs, softening it before sliding his feet into the fleece-lined interior and pulling the thongs taut. He reaches for his tunic, a heavy, undyed garment that feels like armor against the encroaching chill. As he pulls it over his head, the smell of the house smoke, earth, and families momentarily concentrated before the cool air of the hall rushes back in. He reaches for his belt, a broad strap of cowhide with a simple iron buckle. He cinches it tight, feeling the familiar pressure against his waist, and then checks the knife that hangs in its sheath at his hip. He draws the blade an inch from its leather housing, the steel catching a stray glint from the hearth, before snapping it back with a dull, metallic click. He stands, his joints responding with a series of quiet pops, and walks toward the center of the room. He pauses by the fire, letting the rising heat touch his palms one last time. He looks at the carved central pillar, the wood grain appearing like a frozen whirlpool in the low light, and runs a hand along the smooth, soot-stained beam of the doorframe. It is a gesture of acknowledgement, a silent touch of the home before he commits himself to the sea once more. As Bjorn lifts the latch, the iron feels bitingly cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of his skin. He opens the door slowly, and the pre-dawn world greets him with a profound, lung-clearing chill. He steps outside, his boots finding the frost-whitened grass of the village common. The light has changed, since his midnight vigil. The silver blue of the moon has been replaced by a thin, watery grey that seems to seep from the mountains themselves. His breath forms a thick, persistent cloud that drifts lazily in the still air. The scent of the outside is now dominated by the smell of the incoming Tidor, mineral-heavy aroma of deep water and wet stone. He walks toward the shore, the village around him appearing as a collection of dark, silent mounds beneath a sky that is rapidly losing its stars. The silence is so absolute that he can hear the rhythmic thud-thud of his own heart and the faint, distant hiss of the water retreating from the high water mark. He reaches the edge of the pebbles, and as he looks down toward the cove, he sees the first transformation of the day. The boats, which have been ink-black shadows for hours, are now beginning to take on their true forms. A dim, grey-violet glow, the first true herald of the coming sun, has begun to touch the high, elegant curves of the prows. The tarred hulls glisten with a matte sheen of frost, the ice crystals catching the increasing ambient light and turning the wood into something that looks like forged iron. The oarlocks, the thwarts, and the coils of rope in the sterns are slowly being revealed, stripped of their nighttime mystery and returned to their roles as tools of labor. The sea beyond them is no longer black, but a deep, churning steel grey. The waves beginning to take on a three-dimensional shape as the light defines their crests. Bjorn stands at the edge of the world, his figure a solitary sentinel in the greying light, watching as the cold, silent theatre of the north prepares for its first act. The day has not yet begun. The sun is still a hidden promise beneath the horizon. But the village, the boats, and the sea are all held in this singular, expectant moment of the dawn's first grey touch. The dim, grey-violet light of the early morning continues to expand, soaking into the fabric of the village like water into wool. It is a slow, methodical reclamation of the world, where the sharp, crystalline edges of the night are gradually softened by a pervasive, pearlescent haze. High above the fjord, the sky has transitioned from a bruised charcoal into a vast, unblemished expanse of pale slate, and the stars have all but vanished, leaving only a ghostly suggestion of their presence in the deepest reaches of the zenith. The silence of the midnight hours has not been broken so much as it has been reshaped. As the light grows, the longhouses seem to exhale. Thin, delicate ribbons of pale blue smoke once again begin to coil upward from the roof vents, no longer drifting in the lazy loops of the night, but rising with a new, purpose-driven vigor as the hearths are stoked with fresh birch and peat. The aroma of the village shifts subtly, the cold, mineral scent of the frost being overtaken by the hearty, grounding smell of roasting grains and the resinous temps of wood catching flame. Slowly, the heavy timber doors of the dwellings begin to swing open, each one announcing its movement with a low, resonant groan of iron and oak that carries clearly across the frost-white common. Women step out into the biting air, their forms wrapped in thick, undyed woolen shawls that provide a soft, textural contrast to the hard granite of the cliffs. They carry heavy wooden buckets bound with copper rings, their boots making a rhythmic, muffled thump on the frozen earth as they head toward the village well or the small, spring-fed streams that trickle down from the heights. There is no haste in their movements. They move with the economy of a people who know the day is long and the cold is a constant companion. Beside them, children emerge, rubbing sleep-heavy eyes with small, chapped hands, their breath forming tiny, fleeting clouds of steam as they blink against the new light. They are quiet, humbled by the immense, shivering stillness of the dawn, watching the shadows of the mountains retreat with a sense of wordless wonder. From the various the men begin to converge on the shoreline. They move in small groups of 2 or 3, their silhouettes dark and sturdy against the steel-grey water of the fjord. There is a quiet communal purpose to their stride, a shared understanding that requires no verbal instruction. Bjorn is joined by Leif and Torsten, the men who had checked the holes in the deep night. Their greetings are mere nods, subtle shifts of the head that acknowledge the shared survival of the night and the coming labor of the day. As they reach the beach, the soundscape of the cove becomes a complex, rhythmic tapestry. The previous silence is replaced by the percussive crunch of boots on wet pebbles, the dry, hollow clack of oars being lifted from storage racks, and the rhythmic thrum of heavy hempen nets being gathered. The frost, which had turned the world into a silver-gilded dream, is now being brushed away by the touch of human industry. Bjorn reaches out and runs his hand along the gunwale of his boat, feeling the delicate lace of ice crumble beneath his palm, turning into a fleeting dampness that cools his skin. He lifts a section of the net from the drying poles. The fibers are stiff and cold, but as he pulls them toward the boat, they give a soft, rhythmic rasp that sounds like the breath of the sea itself. The sound of wood creaking becomes more frequent as the men begin to distribute the weight of the gear, the oars being slid into their leather-lined oarlocks with a dull, wooden thud squeak. High above, the seabirds have begun their morning patrol. A pair of black-backed gulls circles the cove in wide, lazy arcs, their occasional sharp cries cutting through the air like blades, signaling that the surface of the water is once again teeming with the movement of life. The tide, having reached its zenith and rested, has begun its slow rhythmic retreat, and the water laps against the stones with a slightly stronger, more insistent cadence. Each wave pulls a handful of small pebbles back into the depths, creating a constant, melodic rattling that serves as the backdrop to the men's preparations. Bjorn moves to the prow of the boat, his boots pressing deep into the wet, yielding shingle. He feels the cold moisture of the beach through the thick leather of his soles, a grounding sensation that connects him to the very bones of the earth. Leif and Torsten take their positions along the sides of the hull, their feet splayed wide for balance, their hands bracing against the rough-hewn, tarred planks of the boat. The wood is bitingly cold, but they do not flinch. They lean into the vessel, their muscles tensing in a synchronized preparation for the launch. On the next swell, Bjorn says, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carries the weight of authority. They wait, their eyes fixed on the rhythmic movement of the fjord. A larger wave, a gentle heave of the deep water, rolls into the cove, its crest a pale, translucent grey. As the water rushes up the beach, surrounding the keel with a cold, bubbling foam, Bjorn gives the signal. With a deep, collective grunt of exertion, the 3 men push. The boat does not move at first. It sits heavy and stubborn against the stones, a creature of the forest resisting its return to the water. But as the swell reaches its peak and begins to pull back, the buoyancy of the sea meets the strength of the men. Slowly, with a long, agonizingly beautiful groan of timber against pebble, the boat begins to slide. The movement is gradual, a steady, rhythmic progression that is felt in the shoulders and the small of the back. The hull grinds over the stones with a sound like a low-frequency thunder, a vibrational roar that resonates through the men's arms. They push in unison, their breath coming in short, rhythmic bursts of silver mist. The boat moves another handspan, then another, the weight of the oak planks becoming lighter as more of the hull is reclaimed by the fjord. The water is now swirling around their knees, a shocking, icy embrace that soaks into their wool leggings, but they do not pause. They continue the push, their boots sliding and gripping the shifting shingle until finally, the friction of the land gives way entirely to the fluid embrace of the deep. The boat enters the water with a soft, final splush, the keel cutting through the grey surface with a grace that belies its massive weight. The transition is complete. The vessel is no longer a heavy, grounded object, but a living thing, responding to the subtle undulations of the tide with a light, buoyant rocking. Bjorn maintains his grip on the prow, guiding the boat as it glides slowly away from the shoreline. The movement is smooth and hypnotic, the wake spreading out behind the stern in a series of delicate, shimmering ripples that catch the increasing morning light. The village, with its shaggy turf roofs and rising plumes of smoke, is perfectly reflected in the glass-like surface of the sheltered cove, the image broken only by the steady, slow-motion progress of the ship. Bjorn watches as the boat finds its equilibrium, the wood groaning softly as it settles into the cold, steel-grey embrace of the fjord. He looks back at the shoreline, where other groups of men are beginning their own launches, the sound of rhythmic pushing and the grinding of stones echoing across the water. The morning is still young, the light still a fragile, watery grey, but the first stage of the day's labour has been achieved. There is a profound sense of peace in this moment, the transition from the stillness of the night to the fluid movement of the morning. The boat continues to glide, a solitary dark shape moving over the mirror-clear water, headed toward the mouth of the fjord, where the open sea waits with its infinite, salt-heavy promise. The world is awake, the cycle has turned, and the village remains held in its ancient, unhurried rhythm of stone, sea, and survival. Gemini said the transition from the land to the water is not an abrupt departure, but a slow, fluid integration into the rhythmic heartbeat of the deep fjord. As Bjorn, Leif, and Torsten settle onto their wooden benches, the boat feels like a living extension of their own bodies, a vessel of seasoned oak that has tasted the salt of 100 seasons. Bjorn takes the lead, or his hands finding the familiar, polished grooves in the wood that have been worn smooth by his own palms over decades of early launches. He dips the blade into the glass-like surface of the cove with a precision that produces no splash, only a soft, swirling vortex that disappears as quickly as it forms. The water here is a deep, translucent steel, so clear in the early light that the pebbles on the bottom are visible for a dozen paces before the depth swallows the light. With each long, steady pull, the oar shaft groans against the leather-lined thole pin, a rhythmic, percussive creak thump that resonates through the hull and into the very marrow of the men's bones. This sound is the foundational music of the morning, a cadence of labour that has echoed off these granite cliffs since the first longships were hewn from the forest. Behind the stern, the wake begins to widen in a series of perfect, silver-edged ripples that stretch out toward the shore, disturbing the mirror image of the village. The reflection of the turf-roofed longhouses wavers and breaks, the shaggy green sod and the rising plumes of blue smoke dissolving into a shimmering mosaic of light. As the boat moves further into the belly of the fjord, the village begins to shrink, the houses appearing more like natural outcrops of the earth than human structures. The morning light, which had been a watery grey, is now beginning to undergo its final, spectacular change. High on the eastern ridges, where the snow-capped peaks bite into the sky, the first true rays of the sun have struck the stone. The grey rock turns to a pale, glowing rose, and then to a brilliant, blinding gold. This light trickles down the mountainsides like liquid fire, chasing the shadows out of the deep ravines and illuminating the high alpine meadows where the mist still clings in thick, white blankets. Gradually, the light reaches the level of the village, touching the shaggy rooftops and turning the frost into a million tiny, sparkling diamonds that glitter with a fleeting, crystalline intensity. The widening fjord begins to reveal its true scale as they move past the sheltering arms of the cove. The cliffs on either side rise up in immense, vertical cathedrals of stone, their faces scarred by the slow passage of glaciers and the persistent gnawing of the wind. In this light, the geography of the coast mirrors the descriptions of the dusk from the night before, yet everything is reversed in tone. Where there were bruising purples and deep indigos at sunset, there are now vibrant greens, startling blues, and the stark, clean white of the morning frost. The sea wrack clinging to the base of the cliffs, which appeared like dark shadows in the moonlight, now shows itself as a rich olive gold carpet of kelp, swaying gently in the rising tide. The scent of the air has shifted again. The heavy, stagnant smell of the village hearths has been replaced by the vast, open-lunged breath of the Atlantica scent of cold, moving water, crushed minerals, and the ancient, unchanging salt of the deep. It is an air that demands alertness, a clean and honest wind that fills the sails of the mind even before the canvas is raised. The repetition of this coastal life is not a burden to Bjorn. It is a source of profound, unshakable comfort. There is a deep-seated grace in the way the night gives way to the day without ceremony or fanfare. A quiet transition that requires no grand gesture. The world simply is, and the people of the village are a part of that being. As he pulls on the oar, he reflects on the balance that exists between the sea and the settlement. The village provides the hands, the timber, and the hearth, while the sea provides the lifeblood, the silver harvest, and the highway to the world beyond. Neither can exist without the other. They are two halves of a single, breathing organism. This rhythm continues regardless of the season, regardless of the storms that might batter the cliffs or the brief golden heat of the northern summer. It is a steady, enduring pulse that transcends the individual lives of those who row these boats. The oars dip and rise, dip and rise. A mechanical prayer of survival that has remained unchanged for generations. Behind them, the village is fully submerged in its morning routine. Although they are now far enough out that individual voices are lost to the wind, the visual cues of life are clear. A woman stands by the water's edge, shaking out a heavy woolen rug, the fabric appearing like a tiny, flapping bird from this distance. Another group of men is working near the storehouses, their movements small and toy-like against the backdrop of the mountains. The smoke from the hearths has unified into a thin, hazy veil that hangs over the cove, a sign of the warmth that will be waiting for them when they return. There is a profound sense of safety in seeing the village diminish. It confirms that the center holds, that the domestic world remains intact, while the men venture out into the wild, shifting territory of the water. The fjord is a transition zone, a space where the rules of the land and the rules of the sea meet and negotiate, and the rowing of the boat is the act of negotiation itself. As they approach the mouth of the fjord, the water changes character once more. The flat, protected surface of the cove gives way to a longer, heavier swell, the slow, rhythmic heave of the open ocean making its presence felt. The boat rises and falls with a new, rolling motion, the hull whispering as it slides down the face of each gentle wave. The ripples behind them are now swallowed by the larger texture of the sea, a complex pattern of whitecaps and deep obsidian troughs. The horizon is widening, the mountains pulling back to reveal the infinite, silver-blue expanse of the North Sea. Here, the light is absolute. The sun has finally cleared the highest peak of the eastern range, and its rays hit the water with a physical weight, turning the entire fjord into a blinding, shimmering field of gold. There is no climax to this morning, no grand conclusion to the journey. The boat continues its steady, outward progress, the men's movements as synchronized and calm as the tide. They are moving toward the deep water banks where the cod and herring congregate, a place they know as well as the paths between their own houses. The transition from the dream-heavy silence of the night to the active, light-filled reality of the day is complete. The stars are gone, the frost is melting into the earth, and the fires in the longhouses are being fed for the day's work. The village, the sea, and the sky are all held in a singular, crystalline moment of existence, a moment that has happened 10,000 times before, and will happen 10,000 times again. The sun rises fully above the jagged rim of the fjord, its light spreading in a vast warm wash across the water, reaching into every crevice of the stone and every fold of the sea. The fleet of small boats moves steadily outward, dark specks on a golden sea, each one a tiny world of wood and wool and human intent. Behind them, the village continues its quiet, methodical morning routine, the sound of the hammers and the voices of the children beginning to rise as the day takes hold. The world is in motion, the cycle is turning, and the steady, enduring rhythm of the coastal life continues its unhurried march through time, as if the night and the day were merely breaths in a long, peaceful sleep.